Hey class, me again. So this is the second part of our lecture on African Americans and Black Americans. So I left off with desegregation. So important to understand, in 1954, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. And this decision declared that racial segregation in public schools, the separate but equal doctrine, was inherently constitutional, in part because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So this ushered in a period of desegregation by law in the South, and particularly where whites largely resisted integration. So there's an increase in violence against black folk. So federal action had to be used to enforce desegregation. We also start to see in the 1950s civil rights groups staging sit-ins and public accommodations. This is when we start to see the growing modern civil rights movement in the United States that started to combat the legacy of Jim Crow in the South. So we saw many demonstrations of lunch counters, bus boycotts, boycotts of other businesses that discriminated against black folk, and also the important civil rights groups that were created at this time, such as the Congress of Racial Equality, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. Some of these really came to the forefront of the civil rights struggle, engaged in freedom marches, voter registration drives, litigation challenges to Jim Crow laws. In the North, we also saw a civil rights movement led by other leaders such as Malcolm X, who challenged the mainstream civil rights movement and advocated for a more self-reliant and aggressive action and protection by any means necessary for black people. Right? There is a document with regard to social philosophy that I had created for a different class. Let me look at the document really quickly so I can tell you which it is. It's titled Notes from Phil 102, Social Philosophy. It's a longer document, but concentrate on the differences between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X with regard to their social philosophy. And there's other black leaders in there as well in the past that you can look at as well. But definitely look at them to look at the differences between their social philosophy. Other leaders came to the forefront, such as Bobby Seale and Huey Newton and the Black Panthers. So during the 1950s and 1960s, there was a lot of white backlash against blacks trying to advocate for their civil rights. This, of course, led to a lot of murders, lynchings, etc. So, in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which was monumental, which talked about voting rights, prohibiting racial discrimination and refusal of public services in all accommodations that are public, banning racial discrimination in employment and union membership, mandating federal monitoring of these things, plus giving the Attorney General powers to sue on behalf of those who suffer discrimination. The next year, this was followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This mandated compliance with voting rights and gave federal oversight mechanisms regarding voting and voter registration procedures in jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination and disenfranchisement against blacks, not just in the South, but also in certain areas in the North as well, with a history of disenfranchisement. This was gutted. The Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court decision in 2013. In the case called Shelby v. Holder, which we will not talk about this, but this basically did away with the federal oversight mechanism with regard to racial discrimination, particularly disenfranchisement, and historically in communities which historically exercised disenfranchisement of black folk, which was a pretty bad decision. Anyway, so the book talks about some other instances of rioting. In the 1960s, we had a particularly violent riot in our area in Newark in 1967. The book also talks about, not so much, but the modern day issue of extrajudicial police killings of black folk, particularly black men. These led to the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. There's a link to the Black Lives Matter homepage that I put on in our content folder because I wanted you to see what they're all about. Forget what you heard. Some people have called it a hate group and terrorist group and a bunch of other things. They advocate violence. This is not true. Do not. So anyway, you can look at the link and see what they're all about. The next section of the book talks about the IQ debate, which we will not talk about now, but basically there used to be this attempt to link inherent traits such as intelligence to race. And this was basically not true. You can read that section, but it's still a debate that goes on today that trying to link race with certain inherent qualities such as criminality, intelligence, things like that, which have all been disproven by scientific research. But there's still this kind of pervasive, lingering prejudice or ideas that somehow these things are linked, which is not true. The next section of the book talks about language as prejudice, and there's something that's not in our book that I wanted to mention, which you have a link to a document that I created in our content folder called Notes from Phil 102. Where is it? Language dyads. It's important to understand that dyads are language pairings. Like, so you might have a pair of words such as man, woman, black, white, straight, gay. So there's always in these pairings one term that's privileged. In the dyad of white-black, the term white will be privileged. The term black will remain invisible or marginalized, and these terms are also value-laden in our language. So the term white is the normative term. The term black is the subordinate term. There's really no meaning of each word without the other in the pair, and these oppositions seem natural. So with these language dyads, we tend to define everything in terms of the privileged term, the white, the default term. The subordinate term, the black term, is defined in relation to the privileged term and are seen as not natural, deviant, inferior. And in our English language, there's a symbolism that happens with just the connotations of whiteness and blackness and the images that they evoke. These images have a very powerful influencing on our minds, shaping our perceptions and preconditionings of our ideas of other people and other groups. So it's important to understand that as well. And our book talks about, we won't discuss it too much, but the book talks about some of the connotations that these words evoke, right? So you'll read that in our chapter. So some social indicators of Black progress is the next section in our book, talking about in areas of education, income, and wealth. So with regard to education, there has been a narrowing of the gap between dropout rates between whites and blacks. In fact, dropout rates for all groups high school dropout rates has significantly decreased over the last several decades for most groups, right? However, we do see still a considerable disparity between the races in college graduation rates, right? And we have to ask ourselves why this is. And many of the reasons why is because some of the resources that are allocated to our communities, right, with regard to education, primary school and secondary school education. But one interesting phenomenon we've been seeing in the last decade or so is the increase in Black females completing college degrees when compared to Black males. And then we have to kind of ask ourselves questions: why is there a disparity between these groups, or why are more Black females completing college where Black males are not? And we have to ask ourselves these questions as well. What is going on? But anyway, so moving along to income and wealth, there is still a huge disparity between white and Black median family income in our United States. Even though the poverty rate has dropped significantly since the 1950s, the income gap between the two groups has definitely increased. One factor that's cited that doesn't just affect Black Americans, but is a big contributing factor, is the feminization of poverty. So this is the high percentage of impoverished families headed by women. And these things are compounded by low-wage jobs, unaffordability of healthcare and childcare, lack of education and job skills. So we see the feminization of poverty, and it's also visible in white and Latinx communities. But it has particularly devastating effects in communities of color where there are less social safety nets, particularly Black communities, right? Another disparity in income and wealth is home ownership. There's a very large disparity between blacks and whites with regard to home ownership, and this has a considerable effect on wealth disparities between the groups, right? With regard to occupation, the book, we're going to skip over that. I don't particularly care for the way they analyzed occupation. Um, Housing, we talked about housing already, de facto segregation that we see in many communities. We had a video earlier this semester with regard to the ways in which Black lenders and people who are Black who are looking to buy in certain neighborhoods are denied or kind of pushed towards renting and buying in other areas that aren't predominantly white. So we still see that. I want to go back to redlining a little bit. This is another process to understand like the wealth and disparities between groups. So when you have in redline communities, you have banks refusing to make loans or on properties in lower income minority neighborhoods. But if they did make loans, they charge much higher interest. Compared to other areas that were considered desirable areas. So in the 1940s, again, when this all started, undesirable communities were Black communities. And look at the map in the north side section of Atlantic City. If you see the red line map, you'll see what we're talking about in a particularly local context, right? So what had happened in these communities was older housing deteriorated. People could not acquire affordable loans to upkeep their properties. It was hard to improve buildings. Potential buyers in these communities could not secure affordable mortgages to buy property because the interest rates would be artificially high. We also start to see a phenomenon of bank branches closing in poor neighborhoods, removing this crucial financial anchor for many communities, and these are sometimes replaced by check cashing things that charge interest rates or fees and stuff like that. Not so much interest rates, but fees on your income for cashing your check, and can compound the effects of poverty in these communities, right? Also, an interesting phenomenon we see is supermarket redlining. We will see in many communities that supermarkets won't do business in redline communities or in redline neighborhoods. This has devastating effects, not only economically, but also health, from a health perspective. It has definitely health consequences. You have a lack of more nutritious food. It's more expensive to buy items from corner stores. People have an extra expense of having to travel out of town to get to a decent supermarket. So it's important to understand how the legacy of redlining has had these overall devastating effects on Black communities economically and socially. And with regard to segregation, it's still significant. In fact, if you look at Philadelphia, particularly northern cities, but Philadelphia, if you look at Philadelphia, it is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, particularly in the East. So it's important to understand that just didn't happen. It was part of a conscious process by dominant society to do this through all the things that we studied, right? So now I am going to stop this video and we're going to move on to video number 3. Thank you very much for your attention and on to the next video. Thanks.